Emma, honey, I know your wedding is important to you, but you have to understand that this promotion party is a real priority for Melissa right now. My mother's words hit me like cold water, each syllable carefully chosen to sound reasonable while cutting straight through to the bone. I'm Emma, 28 years old, and I was standing in my kitchen in Boston when my mother said those words to me. The phone pressed against my ear so hard it hurt, trying to process what I was actually hearing. I'd called to confirm final guest counts for my wedding, the one I'd been planning for 14 months, the one where I was marrying Daniel after 4 years of building a life together, the intimate ceremony for 60 people at a beautiful venue just outside the city. We'd chosen the date together, my parents and I, sitting at their dining room table over a year ago, checking everyone's calendars multiple times to make sure it worked, getting their verbal commitment that they'd be there, that this would be my day. So you're saying you're not coming to my wedding? I heard my own voice, flat and strange, stating rather than asking because some part of me already knew the answer. Your sister needs us there, Emma. This promotion means everything to her, and the party happens to be the same day. We thought you'd understand. My father's voice joined in from the background, that tone he used when he'd already made up his mind and was just waiting for me to accept it. It wasn't the first time. That thought arrived unbidden but undeniable, settling into my chest with familiar weight. It wasn't the first time I'd come second to Melissa, my younger sister, 25 and golden, and somehow always more deserving of our parents' attention, their time, their pride. I stood there in my kitchen, looking at the engagement photo on my refrigerator, Daniel's arms around me, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said, and I tried to understand how I'd become so invisible to the two people who were supposed to see me first, who were supposed to love me most, who were supposed to show up when it mattered. My mother was still talking, explaining logistics of Melissa's party, the restaurant they'd booked, how Melissa was so nervous about her new role as assistant store manager, how she needed their support during this transition. I listened to her words, hearing everything she was saying and everything she wasn't, and felt something shift inside me, something that had been bending for years finally reaching its breaking point. I have to go, I said quietly, and ended the call before she could respond. Before I could hear another reason why my wedding day mattered less than my sister's party, before I had to face the question that was echoing louder and louder in my mind. How did I become so invisible to my own parents? Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The question kept echoing in my mind as I lay awake that night, Daniel sleeping beside me, and I found myself traveling back through years of moments I'd tried so hard not to examine too closely. Memories I'd filed away under, "It doesn't matter," or "They were busy," or "I'm probably being too sensitive." I was 17 when I graduated from high school, third in my class with a 4.3 GPA, accepted to Northeastern University with a partial academic scholarship, standing on that football field in my cap and gown, scanning the crowd for my parents' faces and finding their seats empty. They'd called that morning, apologetic but firm, explaining that Melissa had a dance recital that same afternoon, the spring showcase for her studio, and she was performing a solo she'd worked on for months, and surely I understood that they couldn't miss that my graduation ceremony was long, and I wouldn't even notice they weren't there among all those people. I noticed. I stood there receiving my diploma, shaking the principal's hand, listening to him congratulate me on my scholarship, and I noticed the empty seats with the kind of clarity that burns itself into your memory forever. My grandmother was there, and Uncle James and Aunt Carol, and they cheered loud enough for a dozen people, but I still noticed the absence of the two people who should have been there first. That was the beginning, or maybe it wasn't the beginning, but it was the moment I can point to now and say, that's when I knew, even though I spent the next 11 years trying not to know it. College acceptance had been celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, my mother making my favorite pasta, my father saying he was proud, words that felt thin and obligatory. The conversation shifting within 20 minutes to Melissa's excitement about making the cheerleading squad at her high school. I worked 2 jobs through college, waiting tables and tutoring, because my parents paid Melissa's tuition in full while explaining to me that I was so capable and independent, and the scholarship covered most of mine anyway. And wouldn't it be good for me to learn financial responsibility? I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in architecture, won the department's top thesis award, had 3 different firms recruiting me before graduation, and my parents sent flowers to my apartment with a card that said, "Congratulations, we're so proud," but didn't make the trip to Boston for the ceremony because it was the same weekend Melissa was moving into her first apartment and needed their help. I kept thinking if I just accomplished enough, achieved enough, proved myself enough, they would finally see me the way they saw her, would finally look at me with that unquestioning pride and devotion they gave her so effortlessly. But each achievement only seemed to confirm for them that I didn't need their attention because I was doing fine on my own, while Melissa needed their constant support and celebration for every small milestone because she was more fragile, more dependent, more deserving of their limited emotional resources. The pattern didn't end with college, didn't soften as we all became adults, didn't fade the way I kept hoping it would when I proved myself in the real world beyond our family dynamics. I landed a job at Fletcher and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious architectural firms, straight out of graduate school, starting salary of $72,000, with a clear path to partnership, working on projects that would reshape the city's skyline, and my parents' response was a brief congratulations, followed immediately by a longer conversation about Melissa's new position as a sales associate at a retail store in the mall near their house. I was 24, designing a mixed-use development in the Seaport District, working 70-hour weeks and loving every exhausting minute, while Melissa was on her 3rd job in 2 years, having left the first because her manager was mean, and the second because the commute was too stressful, and somehow her struggles earned more of my parents' emotional energy than my successes ever could. When I got promoted to project manager at 25, youngest in the firm's history to reach that level, I called my parents during my lunch break, excited to share the news. And my mother answered with, "Oh, that's wonderful, honey, but I only have a minute because I'm helping Melissa look at apartments online. She's thinking of moving closer to the city, and we're so excited to help her with the security deposit." I bought my first home when I was 26, a small condo in Cambridge that I'd saved for meticulously over 3 years, putting away money from every paycheck, researching neighborhoods, working with a realtor, going through the entire process alone because my parents were too busy to help me look, and when I called to tell them I'd closed on the property, they said they were proud and promised to visit soon. They came once, 6 weeks later, stayed for 45 minutes, walked through quickly while my mother commented that the kitchen was smaller than she'd expected, and then left because they had dinner plans. 4 months later, Melissa decided to move apartments for the 4th time in 2 years, and my parents drove to the city, rented a truck, spent an entire weekend helping her pack and unpack, repainted her living room, bought her new furniture, and posted a dozen photos on Facebook about their fun weekend helping our girl get settled. My 27th birthday fell on a Saturday that year, and I waited all day for a call that never came, finally texting them that evening to make sure everything was okay, and my mother responded at 10 p.m. with, "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry. We completely forgot. We've been planning Melissa's birthday party next month, and it slipped our minds. We'll make it up to you." Melissa's 24th birthday 2 weeks later was celebrated with a surprise party my parents organized. 50 guests, catered food, a cake from an expensive bakery, gifts wrapped elaborately, and a toast from my father about how special his youngest daughter was and how proud they were of the woman she was becoming. I'd been financially independent since graduation, never asking them for money, never needing their help with rent or bills or unexpected expenses, building my career and my life with the kind of self sufficiency they'd always praised, while Melissa received regular help from them, checks for rent when she came up short, grocery money, gas money, insurance payments, a steady stream of financial support they justified by saying she was still finding her way. I met Daniel when I was 26, a fellow architect who just joined Fletcher and Associates, and we started dating after working together on a residential project in Beacon Hill. And when I finally introduced him to my parents 4 months into our relationship, they were polite but distant, asking him basic questions and spending most of the dinner talking about Melissa's new boyfriend, a guy she'd been seeing for 3 weeks, who apparently was so charming and so attentive and exactly what Melissa deserves. Daniel and I had been together for 2 years when he started noticing things I'd trained myself not to see. Small moments during family dinners or phone calls, when he'd glance at me with something between confusion and concern. And finally, one night after we'd had dinner with my parents and spent 2 hours listening to them discuss Melissa's apartment search, he asked me gently if I'd noticed that they hadn't asked me a single question about my life all evening. I defended them reflexively, hearing myself make excuses I'd been making for years, telling him they were just distracted, they were busy helping Melissa through a transition, they didn't mean anything by it. But Daniel just looked at me with those kind, steady eyes and said, "Emma, you matter too. You know that, right?" And something in my chest cracked open just slightly. He proposed 6 months later on a Thursday evening in October, taking me back to the coffee shop near Fletcher and Associates where we'd had our first conversation outside of work. And it was perfect, thoughtful, exactly right. The kind of proposal that reflected how well he knew me and how much he valued the quiet, meaningful moments over grand gestures. I called my parents immediately after, still crying happy tears, my hand shaking as I held up my phone to show them the ring over FaceTime, and my mother said, "Oh, that's wonderful, honey, congratulations," in the same tone she might use to acknowledge that I'd bought new curtains, and my father added his congratulations. And then within 3 minutes, my mother was telling me that Melissa was being considered for a promotion at work, and how exciting that was and how proud they were that she'd really turned things around at this job. We had a small engagement party 2 months later, 30 people at a restaurant in Cambridge, and my parents arrived 40 minutes late, stayed for less than an hour, and left early because they had a long drive home. And my father had an early golf game the next morning. But they stayed long enough to mention 3 times that Melissa was also getting serious with her boyfriend Connor, and they wouldn't be surprised if she was engaged soon too. She was, 6 months after my engagement, after dating Connor for 8 months total, and my parents threw her an engagement party that had twice as many guests, a catered buffet instead of a restaurant tab, a custom cake, and decorations my mother had spent weeks planning, posting dozens of photos on Facebook with captions about her baby girl's special day and how blessed they were. I started planning my wedding with the kind of careful optimism I'd always brought to my relationship with my parents, thinking that surely this would be different. Surely my wedding would be the moment they finally showed up for me, the way they showed up for Melissa. And when I called my mother to ask if she wanted to help me start looking at venues, she said yes, but sounded distracted, and over the next few months I learned what distracted really meant. She canceled our first 3 dress shopping appointments, finally came to the fourth, but spent the entire time on her phone texting with Melissa about centerpiece options for her engagement party, barely looking up when I stepped out of the dressing room in the dress that made me feel beautiful and hopeful, and like maybe I could be a bride whose mother cared. I found the dress, bought it, sent her a photo later, and she texted back, "Very pretty," with a smiley face emoji. And I sat in my car in the parking lot of the bridal shop and finally let myself acknowledge the warning signs I'd been seeing, but refusing to name. The growing certainty that my wedding was becoming just another event they would participate in minimally, while saving their real enthusiasm for whatever Melissa needed. But even then I told myself I was being unfair, reading too much into things, letting old hurts color new situations, because surely, they would show up for my wedding day itself. Daniel and I chose a date 14 months in advance, a Saturday in late April when the weather in New England would be perfect, and the gardens at the Willowbrook estate outside Boston would be in full bloom. And I called my parents the day after we booked the venue to make sure they could attend. And they confirmed yes, they'd be there. They wouldn't miss it. And I let myself believe them with the kind of desperate hope I'd been clinging to for 28 years. We planned for 60 guests, intimate enough to feel personal, but large enough to include everyone who mattered. And I found myself actually excited about the planning process, imagining my mother and me looking at flowers together, tasting cakes, addressing invitations side by side the way I'd always pictured we would when I got married. But within weeks, I realized that the mother-daughter wedding planning experience I'd imagined existed only in my head. She canceled our first meeting with a florist, saying something had come up with Melissa, then canceled our appointment with the caterer 2 days before we were supposed to go, then forgot entirely about the cake tasting I'd scheduled and confirmed with her 3 times, and when she did occasionally agree to meet with me about wedding details, she arrived distracted, checked her phone constantly, and brought every conversation back around to Melissa's life, her job, her apartment, her relationship with Connor, as though my wedding was just an inconvenient interruption in the more important narrative of my sister's daily existence. The dress shopping day came 6 months before the wedding, and she'd already canceled 3 previous appointments, claiming she had conflicts or wasn't feeling well or needed to help Melissa with something that couldn't wait. But finally, she agreed to come to the bridal boutique in Newton, where I'd made an appointment, and I drove there full of hope that this would be the moment we'd connect, that seeing me in wedding dresses would remind her that I was her daughter too, that I mattered too. But she walked in 15 minutes late, immediately pulled out her phone, and spent the entire 2 hours texting with Melissa about centerpiece options for some party while I tried on dress after dress, stepping out of the dressing room to show her and having to say "Mom" twice or 3 times before she'd glance up from her screen, offer a quick "That's nice" or "Not sure about that one," and return her attention to her phone. I found my dress anyway, the one that made me feel beautiful despite everything, fitted lace with delicate beading and a cathedral train, and when I stepped out wearing it, the consultant gasped, and the other brides in the shop stopped to look, and my mother glanced up from her phone for perhaps 5 seconds, said, "Very pretty, honey," and went back to typing, and I stood there on the platform in front of the three-way mirror, looking at myself in my wedding dress. And I understood with sudden terrible clarity that she wasn't going to show up for me, not in the ways that mattered, not ever. But even then, I told myself the wedding day itself would be different, because surely no parent could miss their child's actual wedding. 6 months before my wedding date, Melissa called me at work, excited and chattering, to tell me she'd been promoted to assistant store manager and was planning a celebration party, and she mentioned the date, and my heart stopped because it was April 23rd, the exact date of my wedding, and I waited for her to realize the conflict and laugh about the coincidence and say she'd obviously pick a different date, but she just kept talking about party plans, and finally I interrupted and said, "Melissa, that's my wedding day." And there was a brief silence before she said, "Oh, is it? I thought your wedding was in May." Even though I'd told her the date at least 10 times. And she said she'd already told our parents and started planning, and it would be hard to change everything now. And I hung up and immediately called my mother, my hands shaking, and said, "Mom, Melissa scheduled her party for my wedding day." And my mother's response, in a perfectly calm voice, was, "Yes, she mentioned that. I'm sure we'll figure something out." I waited 3 weeks for my mother to call me back after I told her about the scheduling conflict, checking my phone obsessively every day, telling myself that surely she was working on a solution, surely she was telling Melissa to pick a different date because, of course, a wedding took precedence over a promotion party. But the call never came, and I finally reached out again 3 months before the wedding, my voice carefully controlled as I asked if they'd talked to Melissa about changing her party date. My mother's response was measured and calm, as though she'd rehearsed it, saying, "Emma, both events are important to this family, and we're trying to figure out how to honor both of you. And I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized she was actually treating these two events as equivalent, as though my wedding and my sister's work party held the same weight. I said, keeping my voice steady, "Mom, it's my wedding versus a party. One is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and one is a celebration that could happen any Saturday." And there was a long pause before she said she understood my perspective, but I needed to understand that this promotion meant everything to Melissa, that she'd struggled so much in her career, and this was finally her moment to shine, and wouldn't I want to support my sister during such an important time in her life? My father got on the phone then, his voice carrying that tone of forced reasonableness he used when he'd already made up his mind, but wanted to appear open to discussion. And he suggested that maybe Daniel and I could move our wedding date, just shift it by a week or two. And I felt the room tilt slightly as I explained that we'd booked the venue 14 months in advance, that we had a signed contract, that we had 60 guests traveling from different states, some from different countries, that we had vendors and hotel blocks and a honeymoon booked, and he said, "Well, it was just a thought, no need to get upset," as though I was being unreasonable for not wanting to reschedule my entire wedding to accommodate my sister's party. The conversation ended with my mother saying they'd see what they could work out. Maybe they could stop by my wedding briefly before heading to Melissa's party, and I hung up feeling nauseous, understanding with creeping certainty that they were actually considering missing my wedding, but still clinging to the desperate hope that when the time came, they'd make the right choice. 2 months before the wedding, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing blueprints at the office, and her voice was gentle in that particular way that meant she was about to deliver bad news she wanted me to accept gracefully, and she said, "Emma, honey, your father and I have talked about this a lot, and we've decided we need to be at Melissa's party. She really needs us there for her big moment, and you'll have Daniel's whole family at your wedding, so you'll be surrounded by people who love you, and we'll celebrate with you another time. Maybe we can take you and Daniel out to a nice dinner when we're all back in town." I sat there in my office, blueprints spread across my desk, phone pressed to my ear, and I couldn't speak for a long moment because I was trying to process what I'd just heard, trying to understand that my parents were actually choosing to skip my wedding. And when I finally found my voice, I asked, "You're not coming to my wedding?" And my father got on the line and said in that hearty, case-closed tone he used when he wanted to end uncomfortable conversations, "Your wedding will be beautiful, with or without us, Emma, but this promotion is huge for your sister. It's a really big deal, and the party is smaller and more intimate, and she specifically asked us to be there, and you have to understand, she needs our support right now." I tried to explain what they'd be missing, walked through it point by point as though I was presenting evidence in a case I had to win, telling them about the father-daughter dance we'd planned, about how I'd imagined my father walking me down the aisle since I was a little girl, about the mother-son dance where my mother would dance with Daniel and welcome him into the family, about the toast my father was supposed to give. But my mother just kept saying, "We'll do all of that at the dinner we'll take you to. It will be special. You'll see." And I realized with absolute clarity that they didn't understand what a wedding was, didn't understand what they were choosing to miss, or perhaps they understood perfectly and simply didn't care enough to choose differently. I hung up the phone and sat in my office for what might have been 10 minutes or an hour, staring at the blueprints in front of me without seeing them, feeling a numbness spread through my body that was almost worse than pain, because at least pain would have confirmed that I still had the capacity to feel something. And when Daniel called 20 minutes later to ask how my day was going, I told him in a voice that sounded flat and strange even to my own ears, and there was a long silence on the other end before he said very quietly, "I'm coming to get you." And I said no, I was fine. I'd finish my work and come home. But he showed up at my office 40 minutes later anyway, and took one look at my face and pulled me into his arms while I stood there rigid and dry-eyed, because I couldn't cry, couldn't process what had just happened, couldn't make sense of the fact that my parents were actually going to miss my wedding. Daniel wanted to call them immediately. His jaw set in that way it got when he was furiously angry, and he said he was going to tell them exactly what he thought of their decision, that they were acting unconscionably, that no parent should treat their child this way. But I stopped him with a hand on his arm and said, "It won't change anything." And I knew that with absolute certainty, because if they were capable of being swayed by reason or emotion or basic human decency, they would have made a different choice already, and nothing Daniel or I said would suddenly make them see me as worth showing up for when 28 years of trying hadn't accomplished that. Over the next 2 weeks, I had to tell people that my parents weren't coming to the wedding, and each conversation felt like swallowing glass, starting with my bridesmaids who responded with shocked silence, followed by furious indignation on my behalf. And then Daniel's parents who looked at each other with the kind of bewildered disbelief that came from people who couldn't fathom prioritizing anything over their children's major life events. And then my extended family, aunts and uncles and cousins, who'd assumed my parents would obviously be there, and whose reactions ranged from confusion to outrage. My grandmother called me 3 days after I told my Aunt Susan, and I could hear the tightly controlled fury in her voice when she said, "Emma, sweetheart, your Aunt Susan just told me that Patricia and Richard aren't coming to your wedding." And I confirmed it was true. They'd chosen to attend Melissa's promotion party instead, and there was a long silence before my grandmother said, in a voice shaking with anger and disappointment, "I didn't raise your mother to act this way. I don't know what happened to the daughter I thought I knew, but this is inexcusable." My Uncle James, my father's younger brother, called me the next day and said he'd heard about my parents' decision, and he wanted me to know that if I needed someone to walk me down the aisle, he would be honored to do it. And I accepted because the alternative was walking alone, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough for that. But even as I thanked him, I felt the wrongness of it, the fact that my wedding had become defined by my parents' absence rather than by the marriage I was entering into. And I realized with sudden clarity that I had a choice to make. I could let their decision poison my wedding day, could spend the whole event focused on the empty seats where they should have been, or I could choose to make the day beautiful anyway, to celebrate the man I was marrying and the life we were building and the people who did choose to show up for us. And I decided in that moment, standing in my kitchen with the phone still in my hand after talking to Uncle James, that I wouldn't let them take this from me too, that I'd already given them 28 years of hoping for recognition, and I wasn't going to give them my wedding day as well. I threw myself into work with an intensity that surprised even my colleagues, channeling all the hurt and confusion about my parents' decision into the one place where I felt competent and valued. And it turned out that timing mattered, because 6 months before my wedding, right around the time Melissa announced her promotion party date, my firm was competing for a commission that would define the next phase of my career. The project was designing the new headquarters for ValueTech, a rapidly growing technology company that was relocating its main operations to Boston, and they needed a building that would house 800 employees and represent their commitment to innovation and sustainability. And when my senior partner called me into his office and asked if I wanted to lead the design team, I said yes immediately, partly because it was an incredible opportunity, and partly because I needed something to pour myself into that wasn't wedding planning with a mother who couldn't be bothered to look up from her phone. I spent late nights at the office sketching concepts and refining designs, creating something that was innovative and employee-centered, with green spaces integrated throughout the building and natural light flooding every floor. And Daniel would bring me dinner at 9 or 10 at night, sitting with me while I worked, believing in my vision even when I doubted myself, telling me that my design was going to win because it was brilliant and thoughtful and exactly what ValueTech needed. 3 months before my wedding, right around the time I was desperately waiting for my mother to call me back about the scheduling conflict, my firm made our final pitch to ValueTech's leadership team, and I presented my design concept to a room full of executives and decision-makers, walking them through every detail, explaining how the building would foster collaboration while respecting the need for focused work, how it would minimize environmental impact while maximizing employee well-being, and the presentation went exceptionally well. well enough that I allowed myself to hope, though the decision was still pending and wouldn't come for weeks. I didn't tell my parents about the project because they never asked about my work anyway, and by that point I'd learned that sharing my professional achievements with them only led to disappointment when they responded with distraction or redirected the conversation to Melissa, so I kept this huge, career-defining possibility to myself, discussed it only with Daniel and my colleagues, and waited to hear if we'd won the commission. 2 months before my wedding, on the same week that my parents called to tell me they'd decided to skip my wedding for Melissa's party, I got the call from my senior partner that Value Tech had chosen our firm and specifically chosen my design, that I would be the lead architect on a $50 million building project, the youngest lead architect the firm had ever appointed to a commission of this magnitude, and the firm was promoting me to senior architect immediately with a salary increase to $180,000, plus a bonus structure tied to the project's milestones and profit sharing that could add another $50,000 annually. The celebration at my firm was effusive and genuine, with partners who'd worked there for 30 years shaking my hand and telling me I'd earned this, that my design was extraordinary, that they were proud to have me leading this project, and I felt seen and valued in a way I'd never felt with my own family. But even in that moment of professional triumph, part of me wanted to call my parents and share the news, wanted to hear pride in their voices, wanted them to understand that their daughter had accomplished something remarkable. I called them that evening, still riding the high of the promotion announcement, and told my mother about the commission and the promotion and the salary increase. And the conversation lasted perhaps 90 seconds before she said, "That's nice, honey. That's really great. Did you hear that Melissa got Employee of the Month at her store? They gave her a $50 gift card and put her picture up in the break room, and she's just so proud. You should call her and congratulate her." And I said I would, and hung up and sat on my couch staring at nothing, understanding with perfect clarity that nothing I achieved would ever be enough to make them see me the way they saw Melissa. That I could design 100 buildings and it wouldn't matter because they'd already decided which daughter's accomplishments deserved their attention. The week of my wedding arrived with an unexpected calm that settled over me like a blanket, a sense of resolution that came from having processed my parents' absence and made the deliberate choice to focus on celebration rather than loss. And I moved through the final preparations with a clarity of purpose that surprised me, checking off items on my timeline, confirming details with vendors, responding to last-minute guest questions, all while feeling held and supported by Daniel's family in a way that was both comforting and bittersweet, because it highlighted what should have been there from my own parents. Daniel's mother arrived 3 days before the wedding and immediately took over the small tasks I'd been handling alone, confirming flower deliveries and calling the venue about table arrangements, treating me with a tenderness that made my throat tight. And my grandmother flew in from Arizona 2 days early, insisting on staying at our apartment rather than a hotel, bringing with her a fierce protectiveness and barely contained anger at her daughter's behavior that she tried to hide, but that I could see simmering beneath every kind word she directed at me. Uncle James called me 4 times during wedding week, each time with a question about the ceremony or reception, and I realized on the third call that he was nervous, that he was taking his role as seriously as if he'd been preparing to walk his own daughter down the aisle. And when he came to the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding, he pulled me aside and we walked through the processional pace 3 times until he felt confident he wouldn't rush or stumble. The rehearsal dinner itself was intimate and perfect, held at a small Italian restaurant that Daniel and I loved, with 40 of our closest family and friends gathered around long tables. And there was a moment when I looked at the empty seats where my parents should have been and felt the sharp edge of their absence. But then I made myself look at the full seats instead, at Daniel's parents and siblings, at my grandmother holding court at one end of the table, at Uncle James and Aunt Jennifer, at my college friends who'd flown in from 3 different states, at Daniel's colleagues and mine, and I chose to focus on who was there rather than who wasn't. Daniel gave a toast that made me cry, talking about my strength and resilience, and how his family was now mine, without qualification or reservation, and I gave my own toast, thanking everyone for being there when it mattered. And I saw my grandmother's eyes flash with approval at the subtle emphasis, understanding exactly what I meant. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, my parents were at some restaurant helping Melissa prepare for her promotion party, and at 8:30 that evening, I received a text from my mother that said, "Hope wedding prep going well. Have fun tomorrow," with 3 heart emojis, the casual cheerfulness of it suggesting she thought she was being supportive, as if they were missing a casual brunch rather than my wedding. And I stared at the message for a long moment before setting my phone face down on the table without responding, because there was nothing to say to someone who fundamentally didn't understand what they were doing. Wedding morning arrived with perfect May weather, sunny and 72 degrees with a light breeze, and I got ready surrounded by my bridesmaids in a suite at the venue,